Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Orbis Cascade Alliance Accessibility Days, or welcome if this is the first session you've been able to join us for. Apologies for those who have heard it a couple times today, but I just want to go through the housekeeping reminders. Don't forget that all sessions are being recorded. We welcome you to come back to the Accessibility Days homepage and check out those recordings. I'm going to drop that link in chat. But to keep the recording clean, please make sure that you are muted unless you are participating in the Q&A. I liked how our keynote speaker said it. If you're looking for clarification on a point they're making, please feel free to jump in and have a question. Otherwise, waiting until the end, we'll be taking questions either through chat or by unmuting yourself and speaking to the group. Camera on is completely optional, totally up to you. I'll be going back and forth myself. We've got about 4 minutes before we're going to actually start the Fix My Files group, but I can give a short introduction to them. This next presentation is from our Accessibility Standing Group, which Emily Pearson has been a noble leader for, gosh, how long now? 2 years. With her is Gloria Doherty and Jennifer Wells. Unfortunately, Andy Andrews was unable to make it today, so we're doing a little bit of a quick shuffle around for their presentation. So I just want to say a huge public thank you for this group of folks for them being light on their feet to pull this off, and to also ask you all for grace as we go through. Oh, I see Gloria put in the chat, captioning is available by clicking the live transcript button in the bottom toolbar. It's awful trying to demonstrate how Zoom works when you are on Zoom, but if you have any trouble with that, do put a note in chat and we'll get to you. You can also contact Elizabeth Duell by sending her a direct message in chat if you have any technical issues. Anything people would like to add for the good of the order while we wait for 5 after to roll around?
Yeah, and we definitely do want to wait so we don't have anybody show up late. But I wanted to say something that Elizabeth pointed out to me this morning, which is that it is today the 32nd anniversary of the adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So kind of an important milestone on a very suitable day for our programming. So I thought that was kind of neat. Thanks for digging that up, Elizabeth. We do still have quite a few people coming in through the waiting room, so we appreciate your patience as we get them all in and seated.
Someone added, Happy Disability Pride Month, y'all. As we go, if you have any links or resources that you want to drop into chat, I've been collecting those, and right now we just have a list for what's the keynote speaker prompted, but if you have more, we can continue to add those to a resource that you can access after this presentation.
I was just going to put in a quick plug. Earlier this morning, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced her name, is it Mary Cheney? Asked if we had a hashtag, and so she started tweeting, and I joined her. It's hashtag Accessibility Days 22. So join us on Twitter, share your thoughts, engage. Just another way to collaborate.
I feel like I'm a bad librarian with how badly I know how to use Twitter. So thank you so much, you two, for coming up with that hashtag for us.
I'll teach you one of these days.
I've never used Twitter. I know that probably makes me a Luddite, but I've never used Twitter.
Amazing. Few more seconds. You are not missing anything. We shall see. All right. We're at 1:05, so I'm going to hand it over to the Accessibility Standing Group. Thank you again for your presentation, and I will see you on the flip side.
Okay, welcome everyone. And yes, if you missed Sagan's introduction a few minutes ago, we are the DUX Accessibility Standing Group. Most of us, Gloria, Andy, and I have been doing this for 2 years. Jennifer joined us last year. We also had Aaron Bledsoe with us this year from Western, who wasn't able to come today. And unfortunately, Andy had an emergency, so he wasn't able to join us today. So we're on a little bit by the seat of our pants. So please bear with us as we get through it. We have an activity later that we're gonna see how it goes. So please, if you can be patient, but hopefully we can get you some good resources and some good information on the topic of fixing your files and improving PDFs for accessibility. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Elizabeth. This work came out of our work as a group, identifying gaps in knowledge and practice and accessibility work for the Alliance. So trying to find things for our shared systems and work that can help all of our different situations. So one thing that's hard with a lot of this work is we're all coming from very different resource places, very different staff places. So sometimes it can be hard to find or to create materials to help everyone that meets everyone's different situations and their needs. So we try and create things that are as open, in the spirit of universal design to everybody and all the different types of libraries and institutions we're coming from. And last year, the RSF group did some amazing work with the Helmer Award to get better scanners for people, better OCR software, so that we can make sure our shared resources, the ILLs we're sending out, are of a much higher quality and are much more accessible to people. And so we're kind of seeing this work we did this year as a continuation of their work they took on. That is really amazing and we're really grateful for. And so what we worked on this year was creating a checklist. And I know that this is something that came up today in our great keynote. And like Jess said, this really is a starting point. So this is helping you deal with some of the more tangible things that you can do to create more accessible materials. But it does come with needing to take on training, an openness towards this work, an ability to continue your learning, to find new ways that you can make your work more accessible, to take on training your staff, your student workers, to advocate within your institutions for resources and support for this work. So this checklist, as it were, really, some of these checks are a yes, no, some of them are pretty labor intensive, which we do acknowledge and recognize, and really do require really thinking critically about the work you're doing and training people to think critically about that work as they're approaching making materials more accessible. You can say, yes, we have alt text for our pictures, but really thinking about how to make good alt text, how to make alt text that really is something that is filling in gaps in knowledge or making it clear what the image represents, all the information in that image is an art in some ways. So there's more than just, you've made the alt text, but really thinking about what that is, for example. And so some things that are key parts of this work is first the accessibility toolkit, which we worked on last year, which really is a means by which you can access an enormous amount of training, support, information on accessibility. So whether you're an accessibility pro looking for very niche materials, or you've been assigned accessibility work, you're getting interested in accessibility work, this has been an activating day for you. This is a great place also to start to think about what your role could be, what work you could take on. So the toolkit is a basis for our checklist. And then the next piece is the checklist itself, which I will show a screenshot of in the next slide in just a second. And that is what we're working on today. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Elizabeth. So this is just the first part of the checklist. And it's also worth noting, it's actually bullet points. So we will address that in a second. But this is more of the documentation towards the checklist. So we have it broken down into tiers. We started this in February. So we were motivated by the Olympics. So we have bronze, gold, silver, and gold tiers. And those tiers speak to the level of resources needed, the level of kind of outside skill. Are they things that you can click a button and that'll fix it? Or are they things that maybe you need to think about a little bit further, or maybe involve bringing in, like you need to bring in a subject expert, or you need to bring in an expert more on the assistive technology that can help you make something more accessible. And so they're not quite as first steps. And I'd like to think that these levels allow you to set goals for yourself or for your department, and let you think about, okay, we've achieved, this level of bronze, and maybe a good goal is to try and get some of the silvers done next year. And I realized I need to take a major step back and talk about what this checklist applies to. So like I said, this is coming out of work about OCRing scanned work. And we really think this can be applicable to a lot of different created works in libraries. So whether that's ILLs, scans for within your institution, controlled digital lending, e-resources, thesis creation. So if you're kind of helping your users and patrons create documents that you're then hosting, if you're working in OER work, that these are kind of the documents we're creating, digital documents or digitized documents, that then making sure in your department you're applying these different corrections and remediations to make them more accessible. And yes, internal documentation too. So we often forget to apply these things to ourselves. We think outward, and we need to also remember to think inward and making sure we're making our materials accessible to our colleagues and other staff members. So yeah, so we have our bronze, silver, and gold, and they're all required, and if you need, we had some conversation a little bit earlier about places where they're very maybe prescriptive about only working within very specific ADA requirements. So these are the ADA requirements that we're talking about with WCAG, but also thinking more broadly about what is possible within your institution, what goals you can reach, and where you can get to. So the longer document includes the different levels, document properties, images, headings, and links. So kind of the main parts of a document you're going to see. So then next slide, please. So this is our more one-pager approach that maybe is something you can adapt to then use at your digitization station or wherever this work is being done. As Jennifer noted here, this is actually not an accessible PDF itself. So this really is intended to be something printed that you can use, and that this is something you can adapt for what works for your institution and your situation. So like I said, this might be those different works I listed, ILL, CDL, thesis. Those could be completely different departments, or they could be the same person depending on your institution. So depending on what your needs are and your individual situation, we want this to be adaptable to you. And so some of you might be familiar with images, creating alt text. So that is text that describes the image, provides all the information the image provides to people who can't see the image necessarily, maybe are using a screen reader. Headings, as we're talked about in the presentation earlier today, help people guide themselves through the document. Again, potentially with a screen reader, allow you to get to specific sections to understand what the section is. And then links are a big problem, when people say, click here, or just give the link straight, it is, and it's 3 lines of tracking data at the end of the link, and it's impossible to parse by a screen reader, or making sure it's actually something that is understandable out of context. So if it wasn't a link, if the sentence still makes sense, and if the link makes sense for what it's sending you to. So these are things you maybe have gotten used to as you're doing web development with an accessibility-minded approach, or thinking about, sending emails or creating, your LibGuides and applying these methods. But some things that might not be as familiar to people is thinking more about document properties. So with an example of scanning a textbook to make for course e-reserve. There's a lot of information in a textbook, right? We have all of the headings, but there's also going to be things like, what language is it in? That might not always be in English, right? But you want to make sure that it's being tagged as such, so that somebody, potentially a screen reader, is adapting to that. People understand what's coming in the document. Thinking about all the different sections. A textbook layout can have tables as an asides. They can have infographics that contain an incredible amount of information within an image. And also along with having, words and numbers might also be, portraying a cycle that has arrows that's showing how things interact. They might also not have it, those things might not be clearly delineated with clear boxes, or different sections might be as obvious. So something that requires a lot of support is tagging those documents, tagging those different elements and making sure that they're clear, so that that information can be parsed with a screen reader. There might be things like a lot of decorative images, which aren't necessarily considered something you need to write alt text for, but if you think about it as you're reading a textbook, that gives you a bit of a break. It gives you some more context. It maybe gives you something to think about. So if you're not able to see that image and you might be losing that context or that break even, finding ways that you can help augment that information. So these might be things that have really not been a part of the work you're doing as you're approaching e-reserves. And so that's, like I said, they're requirements, but they're also acknowledging that they're very labor intensive. So we want to give you these different levels so that you can think about, okay, let's get through the first bar of bronze, which is still a difficult level to clear. There's a lot of work that goes into that and still a lot of training and consideration to be taken in. And then how can you then go to bronze and gold, silver and gold? And hopefully in our role with the Alliance, that can help you give some evidence or some support to then take to potentially your library leadership or even beyond that for why you might need to emphasize this work in your digitization work. So, like I said, we don't want to give you, this could be information overload where we're showing you all of the things to fix and all the different things to think about. And even still, this might be really overwhelming that you're like, I don't know what any of these things are. And that's an okay place to be in. There's a lot to take in. I will say, again, a plug for the checklist, the toolkit, which can really help you deduce thinking about specific trainings for just ascribing alt text to images, or just working on how to make sure you're understanding all the capacity you have with Adobe Accessibility Checker, so that you can figure out the different ways you can work through some of these different problems. Okay, so now is when we're going to kind of try and figure out how to move past our breakout rooms. So I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer, who's going to help, and much gratitude to Elizabeth, who's taking on considerable driving, a big ask from us at the 11th hour. So hopefully you can bear with us.
So yeah, we initially were planning to have everyone go into breakout rooms and have some small group discussions, looking at, we have 3 example PDFs, and then using the checklist to do kind of a visual scan initially of what the potential problems could be. But since Andy had an emergency and couldn't be here, that means we have fewer people. And so we decided, instead of breakout rooms, we're just all going to do it as one big group. So I think as long as everyone, all 120 of you are good with this, turn on your mic, raise your hand, get in the chat. Let's see how we do here. That we have on our slide, if you're using captioning, stay in the main room. Something I learned accessibility wise, if you are using the captioning, you don't want to get into a breakout room because it doesn't follow you. So pro tip there. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Elizabeth. Oh, all right, that is the next slide. Let's pull up our examples.
Which one do you want to start with, Jennifer?
Let's start with number 1. All right.
You should be seeing a PDF Adobe Acrobat example 1. That's the theory.
So what I'm going to ask of everyone who's willing to participate here is Elizabeth has the links in the chat to our toolkit and to our checklist. If y'all would be willing to open up that checklist, so thank you again. So it's available in another window, perhaps, so we can go back and forth. And let's take a look at this document. And I want to open it up to the room. What are some things that we notice just by looking at this that could be potentially problems?
I'll be watching chat, so feel free to jump on there if you want to take a guess.
Don't be afraid to unmute yourself also. I'm gonna dive in first so that maybe people will get brave, because I know very little about this. So the thing that I would say that strikes me first is that there's black text and there's gray text. Does that matter?
I think it can. I think that's, I'm seeing Kale in the comments saying inconsistent headings. I think that speaks to the inconsistent headings. It's not super clear if actions and search actions are different headings just from looking at this. They're roughly the same size. I think search actions is slightly smaller, but it's not super obvious. We talk about contrast too. I don't think contrast is actually on our checklist, but I think, Lori, that's what you're getting at with the gray.
Yes, so, and Shannon put in indentations meaning. So yes, is this using formatting to create subheadings, but not using hard coding heading 1, heading 2. So that would indicate to somebody using a screen reader that this is a sub part of actions versus on the same level as actions. Ray said you have to identify search actions as a subheading, like I said just now. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Ray said it better. And with contrast, I think that is on the checklist. And so here the gray could potentially be difficult for people. And also just using different colors. So if you're using blue and red to denote different things without any other indication of their differences, people who are colorblind cannot distinguish those differences. Yeah. So imbuing meaning through color can leave out people. Yes, Catherine would like us to magnify it. Thank you.
Yeah, let's try magnifying to 200%. That looks pretty darn good. So that's a good check. Often that's a problem. So in my work, I do a lot of scanning textbooks, and that is something I'm checking all day is, can I zoom in and is it still crisp? This is a document that was made in a word processor, so it sure better be readable unless someone printed it and scanned it back in, you know. What else?
So then, Elizabeth, could you scroll down a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, we have a table on the second page, I believe.
Is that small enough, or do you want it smaller for people to see?
I think that looks good. So we have Kathy saying inconsistent alphabetizing, numbering in the table. Yep, it's not ordered. It's we don't know if something when you are engaging with these PDFs, and it's kind of hard to show as we're all kind of sharing screens, but you want to be able to tab through it in the correct order too. And it's not immediately obvious if this is tagged correctly in that way. Let's see. Saying the color could make text harder to read, not clear if the table has headings or if the words are just bolded. Exactly. Background color could be a barrier. And tables would be read left to right, so it might need custom OCR to help screen readers distinguish it as a table with 2 columns. All excellent answers.
And something that happens with tables, this is actually from just reviewing it without knowing necessarily if it's tagged appropriately, that this is a good example of something people do, which is that people use tables for formatting. So to create 2 columns and making invisible table lines, just to make the document look the way they'd like it to look. And then if you're using a screen reader, then it's reading it as a table and making it very difficult to parse what exactly the information is telling you, because it's not actually constructed to be a table. Whereas this, with having at least the headings facet code and what it is, that helps. What it is might not be the best label ever, but it at least gets you something. I can't necessarily think, but that does help versus just having an invisible table for aesthetics.
And an excellent example of what not to do and how to use an invisible table is in the printout of the PDF checklist, because I intentionally did that because that's how my brain works, is in a matrix way. It helped me understand it, but that only makes sense when it's printed out. If it's in this digital format, just like Emily said, it's not going to make sense as a table. So just keeping in mind different purposes for different formats. And so we're focusing on digital today.
Do we want to go to the next document?
Yeah, just Ray had another comment saying, honestly, this information might be better presented as a list of definitions and not a table. And that, yeah, that's a great comment. That would be more accessible for sure. All right, we got an image. All kinds of stuff going on with this document.
I'm going to fess up that this document is my fault, so please carry on. I did this.
Well, I'll say also, to give you credit, I meant to say at the beginning, thank you to Lori for giving us these example documents.
Yes.
To work through some of these examples.
Trisha says no header. Kale asks, what's the function of the image besides referring to a great film? Lori, can you answer that?
Yeah, so this is a completely different type of document than what we saw before. What we saw before was documentation kind of in a how-to sort of style. This was a chatty email, as I am famous for creating. So it was meant to be a joke of sorts.
So there may have been more context preceding this, where there was a Ghostbusters joke, I presume.
Yeah, this came directly out of the immediate response to the pandemic in 2020, when we shut the entirety of Summit resource sharing down. And I was trying to write the community and say, look, we just did a big thing. What are we going to do if we ever have to do it again?
So looking at the comments, we have no description of the image, asking, does this need to be an ordered list or would unordered fit better? People love your emails, Lori. But I think, yes, if this were a document that we were presenting, say this is some internal documentation, say you want to archive this and keep it in your Google Drive for, you know, referring to in your work, that throw in a quick alt text for that image, and maybe an unordered list would be better. I'm not sure. I'd have to look through the content. I think these are the kinds of things where it's what makes the most sense to the content.
Yeah, I think the difference there is, you know, are there steps? Is there meaning behind it being numbered in a specific order versus if it were bullet points? I think the document number 13 maybe lends itself to, it makes sense for that's an ordered list, but then going from bullet points to ordered can be confusing. So I think that is sort of a bit of your mileage may vary, but it is a good thing to take into account and to be thinking about. And just a note on emails or on images and emails in Outlook, if you right click on the image, you can add in alt text. On Gmail, you cannot do that, but what you can do is putting in a caption underneath saying a GIF of the Ghostbusters in the library.
And Ray just commented that, so
okay,
yeah.
good. I'm trying to keep up with it.
Not all visually impaired humans use a screen reader. Exactly.
Yes.
Shannon said spacing between numbers. I think visually that would help as well.
That's a question I have, actually. Sorry, nameless, faceless voice coming out of the ether. So I know with a screen reader, additional spaces are kind of sometimes the bane of existence, because every space you type in is read off to you aloud. So you don't want to have a ton of extra spaces, but sometimes I'm guessing it's probably important for those who are sighted and not using a screen reader to be able to have that visual distinction. Is there a balance in there somewhere, like do it or don't do it?
I would say one thing is not using hard spaces like pressing enter and having blank space versus putting in line spacing within the email. So using the kind of formatting bar, creating maybe 1.15, 1.5 to give some more visual space. There might also be like add space before paragraph as an option, if that makes sense. I think for this one, so where you're not having a jump, but instead there's just space added to the line. Hopefully that makes sense without being able to share my screen.
Got another comment saying recently Gmail added alt text to images and emails. When you click on an inline image, an option to edit alt text appears. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, they took that out and I did the DUX presentation on emails and now they're doing a fast one on me. Okay. I think for timing, if we can move on to example 3, please.
Well, and something that we haven't checked in any of these yet is, so we've just been doing a visual scan is what we're calling it. We asked Elizabeth to open these up in Adobe Acrobat so we could see if they are actually tagged. So Elizabeth, if you could click on the little arrow caret on the left-hand side of the screen, in the middle of the screen, to open that extra pane, all the way to the left, down. There we go. So that reveals some more tools. You see an option for bookmarks. I believe we may have to.
If you click on more tools over on the right menu, on the far right.
Thank you, Gloria.
Tools, you bet. And then scroll way down and add accessibility.
There we go. Okay. So this is when in our checklist, when we say things like perform fully pass accessibility checker, this is an option to do that. So there are there's Adobe Acrobat Pro. I believe you have to have Pro to do this. It can't just be Reader. There we tried to provide another option for, I believe Microsoft Word has an accessibility checker. So those are some more tools for how to examine these documents. Kale's asking, what are the reading options? Where are we seeing that? Oh, there. Yeah, go ahead and click on that. So my understanding, and I'm still learning about all this stuff, so jump in, anyone, if you know more than I do, please. But my understanding is that this has to do with how a screen reader, it's literally the order of from one object to another. So how the tags work is you say this is a paragraph, this is an image, this is a new paragraph, this is a heading, etc. And this reading order has to do with what assumptions are made about the document for that. And then let's see, Ray says, I just learned that PowerPoint has an accessibility checker too. Fantastic. Yeah, I believe Office things should. Thank you, Clarissa, for sharing a resource from WWU for accessible documents. We always love more resources. Oh, they're all coming in. And Katie says you can also, I think, in Acrobat, but don't recall, designate a specific reading order for elements on a page, but I don't have much experience with that. Yeah, me neither. And you know, we'll admit this, a lot of this was Andy's expertise, and he can explain a lot of it better than we can.
You're doing a fine job.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, and that speaks to what I was saying earlier with like textbooks where there's different columns of information and maybe, or I think we might have to scoot over so we have time to questions for Jennifer to show some examples of some scans, but the course reserve, that's a old overhead scan of 2 pages, making sure that that's clear that those are 2 pages and it's not trying to read across the page. Maybe if like the gutter is pretty short, small.
Single page.
To clear out the designated area.
Yeah, let's go ahead and if you want to go back to the slideshow, the PowerPoint, the Google slide, Elizabeth.
You want the original PowerPoint or the
PowerPoint, please.
Yeah. Here we go.
Are you seeing what you're supposed to be seeing?
Yeah, that's good.
Fantastic.
So just to follow up with what Emily was saying, I threw in some examples from what I'm seeing while scanning textbooks and things that are bad to watch for, to potentially fix. Also, when you're creating documents, think about this kind of stuff. This is an example from a book where you can see there's this black text over an image. And maybe when you're looking at that book in person, it's legible and readable, but the contrast is really poor for the computer. It just kind of blends all together. It gets flattened. And then I repeatedly had problems with OCR software not recognizing this text or only recognizing portions of it. So don't do that. Let's go to the next slide. An example of something really complex that, I'm seeing Lori's question, would you build a text box around it to make it stand out? Yes, give it a background. If I'm creating that document, I would make sure that there is a solid background behind that text if I want an image behind it. Yeah, so this is it's a chemistry textbook. You see, we have all kinds of crazy notation. We have a diagram. This is an example of something where if you're trying to make this accessible, you need another expert. It's worth calling in a chemistry expert, an accessibility expert, someone who is experienced in describing this kind of notation and language and symbols, so it's going to make sense. Yeah, graphs are hard to describe in alt text. Something that I say a lot in my work is you have to figure out what good enough is. And that can change from day to day. It can depend on who your users are. I am trying to make textbooks accessible for everyone who accesses our library. I'm not the Disabilities Accessibility Services Office. So I may not be investing all the time and effort to make this more accessible, but I know that it could be. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like we talk with the checklist, start at bronze. Maybe you're only checking off a couple things in bronze. That's still something. I don't know if we have time to do the next slide.
Let's do it quickly because I think it's good.
Yeah, this is just an example of bad scanning. Really hard to fix. If you have documents like this, you can see in the middle of the screen, there's kind of a line of glare through that text. So that is interrupting the OCR, the optical character recognition, the text recognition. And I mean, there's just a lot bad going on here. I can see 2 page numbers. It's blurry when you zoom in. You can bang your head against the wall trying to fix something like this, but if you have access to the original text, just redo it. It will save you time. So I don't know, Emily, Gloria, or do we have any questions?
I think we wanted to end on this one for that very reason of, I think sometimes you can get so focused on remediation and you kind of lose sight of an easier solution. It's still, you might need to do some remediation work even with a better scan, but at least it's a better scan. Like Jennifer just said, and Lori's saying every better is better. This is also kind of, please faculty, we don't need your scans that have your margin notes that are handwritten and have been copied 6 times and scanned 7 more times. That we can, maybe we can find the ebook that already has all this material, that we don't need a scan even. So this is part of the moving past just saying yes, 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 but really thinking about what you're looking at, what you're trying to get access to. It might also be with that science textbook. This is kind of pie in the sky, sadly, but maybe again, that's something that the textbook publisher has created a version. There are some softwares that can make some of those equations easier to understand or to access. And so maybe you're taking the long road when there's a shorter path. Again, that's not, I don't want to necessarily chase those every single time, but thinking about these things and seeing if there is something is a good thing to keep in mind, something else you can use.
So we have a question saying, in general, do you make a recommendation for scanning with black and white versus grayscale? I generally prefer grayscale as long as it's a crisp grayscale. So what I find is black and white, or sometimes scanners will call it bitonal. It changes the outline of characters. Things look a little wonky sometimes, and especially if there's images, you definitely don't want to do straight black and white because the meaning can get lost when you're losing those grayscale values in between. I'm just looking to see on our checklist if we had a DPI. For scanning, I know I try and bump that DPI as high as we can make it, so to keep the file size reasonable. That's kind of a balance you want to play with. But if you have a high DPI grayscale, that's going to be pretty good. I would also add, make sure you're paying attention to when things need to be in color, because often, especially in textbooks, there will be charts and graphs where color provides meaning. And again, that's not ideal for accessibility. That's not something we would recommend. But you have to, if you have to know that, like, oh, red means this, make sure that is scanned in color.
Another question we had from Tom, do you have any examples of making fillable forms with checkboxes or radio buttons accessible? And also, Elizabeth, we can go to the next slide, which I think just says questions, but we can at least know that we've turned over to questions.
Ask Lori.
Yes, this is also, before we get to Tom, because we're turning over as a group, we're in sort of an awkward place where we might be able to answer questions, but we're not the team anymore about this specific material. So if you could send your questions to Lori, she can figure out, should it go to the new crew? Should it go to one of us? So just thank you, Lori, for letting us route everything through you. To Tom's question, I've had the most success with using Adobe, and you can set fields as fillable as radio buttons so that people can use a keyboard to navigate between them and select them. I think things are pretty divided on Google Forms. There's been really mixed results of whether or not they're accessible or not, especially if you're doing a pretty extensive matrix of radio buttons, it actually works fairly well in my experience. If you're doing exceeds, meets, less than expectations, and there's like 8 categories, so it's a 8x3 radio. It manages those pretty well, but some of the other things it has a harder time with for keyboard navigation. So for fairly simple forms, I tend to use Google Forms for that reason. I don't know, Gloria or Jennifer, if anybody else has any response to Tom. It is a difficult one. I find most things lacking. Yeah. And then for Tom, as a follow-up, do you tag every box and button in Adobe Acrobat? Yes. And it usually it'll take in the question so that somebody would get the question, can get the question another way, like through a screen reader. And with that, of what kind of, Ray, do you have any tips for removing backgrounds like in the previous example from PDFs? I believe that's the one with the mouse or the animal, the mammalogy.
Yeah. Well, so what I did in that exact example was instead of trying to remove the background, I made sure that the text was recognizable. So I use a piece of software called Abby Fine Reader. It's ABBYY, all caps, Fine Reader. It was definitely a chupacabra, Lori, thank you. And with that, visually, it's not necessarily going to fix that contrast issue, but it will make it so you can highlight the text. And that's kind of a concession that I've made of like, where is my good enough? And I called that good enough. If I wanted to go one step further and actually edit the image, I think what I would do is instead of trying to remove the background, I would create a new text box over it and just try and match the font as best I could. Tom says you can also drop a white rectangle over it and arrange it to the front. Yeah, it depends on what you're working in. If you're able to arrange objects, definitely. But if that's just a scanned flat image, you're fussing around in there.
Kara asked, and Kara, you said this is a basic question, but it really is, it's, I think in some ways the most important question. Can you go through the steps you would take after scanning a document, scan a searchable text? You then need to tag in Adobe Pro. You just check out tagging. Thanks for reviewing. So I said, Jennifer, I think I'd like to hear if you have a good first step you take.
Well, the first step I take is our scanning software already does a passive OCR. So we're already saving as searchable PDFs. I then use the Abby Fine Reader and I give it another pass in that it has a feature called the hot folder where I'm not manually going in and looking at everything. It's just another passive OCR, and it goes through and tags the document and turns headings into bookmarks too. So that's something that I'm still kind of exploring, is how accurate is that kind of AI pass. And then I'm opening it in Adobe Acrobat and I'm catching, oh, this little bit here didn't get OCR'd. And sometimes like you can do another OCR scan in Acrobat. Sometimes it's hit or miss. I might go back in Abby and manually do it. So that's kind of my process. But again, that's needing like specialized software. And I feel like the very basic is making sure you just save as searchable text. If you have an option to OCR something, even like when you're photocopying and scanning a document on the photocopier, look in those settings and see if there's OCR. See if it says searchable PDF somewhere. I don't know, Emily, Gloria?
Yes, I think that, and doing kind of what we did today, and this is kind of what to the point of resources and the checklist being a starting point, is growing your familiarity, your staff's familiarity with reviewing a document and saying, okay, this is something just looking at it, I can tell we're going to need to do more remediation, or, you know, this is a more simple document. We still want to make sure it's passing all the checks in Adobe Acrobat Checker. So that's something that can help you with the tagging and the document properties. But, you know, there aren't images, there aren't graphs, there aren't tables, those kind of usual hangups. So kind of helping separate out, you know, are there color issues? That can be a good way to get started. Gloria, did you have anything?
No, that's all great. And then after that, it's the partnership with the content expert to be able to write narratives if there are charts or tables to convey meaning. Because in addition to those who are using assistive devices, there are a host of people who find it difficult to interpret charts and graphs, that sort of thing. So stressing accessibility for all.
Just a quick comment of Ray saying you can OCR handwritten documents. You would be surprised at how much that comes into play in textbooks. I had a textbook where like the beginning of every chapter was a letter from so-and-so. It was like the stylizing, you know, there's a lot of creative artistic license that happens with textbooks. I think you'd be surprised. And yeah, it looked like a handwritten letter from, I don't know, the editor or someone at the beginning of every chapter. And yeah, that wasn't readable. I had to fix all that. I think we had another question. In general, are there advantages for accessibility with Abby over Adobe? Abby is just way more robust, I think. I find I can do things at a more granular, fine-tuned level if I need to. I'm still learning. I think they both have advantages. I think Abby is also really good if you have a very large volume and you need to do things in batches. Abby's the way to go. And
Lori, you might know better than me. Ray had made a comment that Abby is unfortunately not free, which is very true. And it really is just kind of a superior product in the OCR space, especially. But that was part of what the Hummer grant supported. I think those funds have been completely spent out, but that might be an opportunity for places that weren't able to take advantage of that Hummer, or there's new needs that maybe that's something to look towards. I guess probably next year, but something we can maybe think about as a community if that's something we need a next step to take.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That was purchased with the Helmer Awards. We actually lucked out because we originally had only bought the basic program, and then we found out that the hot folder was in the pro, and they gave us, because we had a large number of licenses, we'd purchased it once, they gave us a deal to upgrade them all to pro, which is what gave us the extra boost.
Thank you.
That hot folder is a marvelous piece of work that is very helpful. We don't usually buy products for our members, but things like grants and awards are something that we can always look into to trying to make those things happen. So there's also the possibility that as a community, we could come together and try to get some kind of an alliance-wide grant to make this happen again. We might want to put that on the radar for our incoming accessibility group as well.
All right,
I was just going to say, I wonder if there's a possibility of the Alliance negotiating with the Abby company to get a consortial deal, kind of like we do shared purchasing for ebooks.
Yeah, I absolutely think if we were to come with some money or with a grant of some kind for a certain amount, I think we could definitely talk with them and say, hey, look, we have a lot of licenses already. We want to buy some more. What can you do for us as a deal? They were very helpful.
Are there any last questions as we transition over?
There is a statement that said it would be awesome to have a webinar with you, Jennifer, for Abby. Possibly an open call.
Yeah, well, that's something to discuss. I'll be continuing with the DUX team, so I'm around. But also, although he's not here, it feels slightly unfair to put him on the spot like this. But I would encourage people to reach out to Andy Andrews if you have hard accessibility remediation questions, because he is our expert. And let's see, I looked up, he's no longer going to be in the library at UW, but he is the Assistant Director of Academic Services for the Disability Resources for Students Office at the University of Washington. There's his email in the chat. So I think that's fair. I don't think he would mind us sending people his way.
And in terms of time, we actually have about 10 minutes before the next session is supposed to start. If people would like to keep asking questions, if presenters are okay with sticking around to answer them. Otherwise, if you would like to take a short break, that is also completely fair.
I think we were booked for 45 and there was kind of a
Perfect.
secret break. So that's why we were saying, okay, we'll move it along.
So seeing no more questions in chat, we will reconvene at 5 after. It's about 9 minutes from